Prior to the 1950s, our rivers were contaminated and our air was full of smog, causing both illness and fatalities. The Environmental Protection Agency has worked for almost 50 years addressing these issues. EPA was created in hopes to contain our environment. As time has passed, its mission has now been moved to protect human health and the environment.
Located in Washington, D.C., the agency conducts environmental assessments, research, and education. It has the responsibility of maintaining and enforcing national standards under a variety of environmental laws through federal, state, and local government. The EPA's enforcement powers includes fines, sanctions, and other measures. The EPA has the power to issue regulations that will be implemented through a budget.
EPA's budget for the fiscal year is created when the President submits a budget request to Congress. This budget is then sent to the House and Senate, where budget resolutions are passed after the subcommittees mark up appropriations. Then the House and Senate vote on the appropriation bills. Once that is completed, they reconcile differences. Lastly, the President signs the appropriations and the budget becomes law.
The environmental movement was provoked by national attention on events like the Santa Barbara oil spill and the increase of smog in highly dense populations like New York City. President Richard Nixon addressed these concerns through creation of the EPA, which he explained in his State of the Union address.
The 70s is, shall we surrender to our surroundings, or shall we make our peace with nature and begin to make reparations for the damage we have done to our air, to our land, and to our water?
Nixon stated that the goal of the EPA was to restore nature to its natural state. Founded in 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency was granted a federal budget of $1,3,984,000. During Nixon's presidency, the EPA enacted two laws. The Clean Air Act of 1970 required industries to meet emission standards and required states to submit implementation plans. Meanwhile, the Clean Water Act of 1972 worked at the creation of national pollution discharge elimination systems, accompanied by massive data collection tasks for the EPA.
During Nixon's presidency, President Gerald Ford stood as an economically concerned environmentalist, deeply committed to achieving a balance between the needs of the environment and the needs of a dynamic, growing economy. Ford allocated $700 million to the EPA in his 1977 budget out of a total budget of $394.2 billion, which was 0.02% of the federal budget. Focused on sewage treatment and the expansion of national parks for wilderness protection.
Succeeding President Ford, President Jimmy Carter was an environmental activist who bolstered environmental protection. Carter increased the EPA budget to over $5 billion in his presidency out of the $664 billion budget, giving 0.7% of the entire federal budget to the EPA. His main focuses for environmental protection surrounded the preservation of wilderness areas of Alaska and the establishment of Superfund sites through the CERCLA law.
The early Reagan administration launched an overt attack on the EPA by combining deregulation with budget and staff cuts. The administration tried to cut the EPA funding by more than 25% in its first budget proposal of $3,676,013,000. In opposition to the expansion of the Redwood National Park in March of 1996, Reagan said, "A tree's a tree. How many more do you need to look at?"
In 1987, Reagan voted a reauthorization of the Water Quality Control Act, only to have his veto overwhelmingly overridden by Congress, allowing the EPA to regulate pollutants in U.S. waters. President George H.W. Bush increased the EPA budget to $5,461,808,000 in 1990 and was well known for his aggressive environmental policy reform. In his 4 years, he strengthened the Clean Air Act and attended an international framework convention on climate change, acknowledging the human role in global climate change.
Forward, President Clinton steadily increased the EPA's budget to $6,658,927,000 in 1994. I believe the strong economy and clean environment went hand in hand. Clinton adopted the toughest standards ever on soot and smog and launched a long-term effort to restore pristine skies and other natural treasures.
President George W. Bush increased the EPA's budget to $8,078,813,000 in 2002. He used an aggressive, inclusive, and science-based approach to sound environmental decision-making. He enacted the Clear Skies Initiative, as well as a number of incentives for private land stewardship and conservation.
In 2010, President Obama increased the EPA's budget to $10,297,874,000. As an environmentalist, his presidency focused on ocean cleanup and clean energy. Presidency, he signed a bipartisan ban on microbeads, rejected the Keystone XL oil pipeline, established the largest ocean sanctuary on the planet, raised fuel efficiency standards, and enacted the Clean Power Plan.
Interpreting the budget of past administrations allows us to see the impacts of the EPA's budget on the environment.
Benefits that have been created by the EPA are now in jeopardy due to the Trump administration. For the third year in a row, the Trump administration has made extreme cuts to the EPA's budget.
With these reductions, more lead, toxic chemicals, and contaminated water will move towards jeopardizing the health and safety of Americans.
Trump, currently in office, has reduced the EPA's budget by 23% in 2019. Currently, Donald Trump's proposed budget for 2020 includes $6.1 billion allocated to the EPA, which is a 31% cut in funding from the past fiscal year.
However, there is a possibility this would change, as last year the EPA received $8.1 billion in funding, which is $2.2 billion higher than what the EPA was originally allocated. What the current allocation represents is Trump's lack of concern for federal environmental protection.
Donald Trump has called climate change a hoax.
It'll get cooler, it'll get warmer, it's called weather.
Now that he's president-elect, here's what's at stake for the future of the environment. The Paris Agreement, which was negotiated last year and came into effect just a few weeks ago, was a monumental step for addressing climate change and setting a path forward for the coming decades to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Donald Trump has promised to cancel the Paris Agreement, or at the very least renegotiate it.
Stop all payments of the United States tax dollars to UN global warming programs.
In recent years, the EPA has moved back to its original mission of protecting human health and the environment. But even with this priority shift, we are still at a loss because we don't have the finances to make these improvements. Current budget for the EPA includes a plan to streamline programs and processes, eliminating many voluntary and lower priority activities, and empowering states and tribes as the primary implementers of environmental programs.
During the first 18 months of the Trump administration, nearly 1,600 workers left the EPA and fewer than 400 employees were hired back to fulfill those jobs. The exodus has shrunk the agency's workforce by 8% to levels not seen since the Reagan administration.
Through lowering the budget, the EPA's progress in environmental issues will decline. By cutting the EPA staff by as much as 2/3, many of the agency's environmental inspectors will no longer be monitoring conditions in their region and ensure that companies are complying with the law.
To state grants would weaken the state's ability to enforce water pollution laws and regulations. The states protect and clean up major polluted water bodies, improve water infrastructure, protect groundwater, and restore beaches and coastal areas, all while overseeing compliance with drinking water standards and providing assistance to water systems.
The federal budget also aims to dismantle the Clean Power Plan, which limits carbon pollution from power plants and is the largest single action the U.S. has ever taken to combat global climate change. The funding for the EPA's Office of Science and Technology would drop by more than a third, eliminating dozens of programs implemented by the Obama administration to fight climate change.
Emissions of carbon dioxide from human activity will continue to increase from a lack of monitoring. Funding for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is proposed to reduce by nearly 20%.
This includes cuts to the Endangered Species Act, the National Wildlife Refuge System, wildlife trafficking prevention efforts, and grant programs. These budget cuts would also eliminate Tiger grants, which support transportation infrastructure investments, and cut the Federal Energy Management Program.
The influence of the environment on our health is evident in current public health problems. Sensationalized by the Flint, Michigan water crisis, officials decided not to treat corrosive water as a cost-saving measure, leading to lead leaching from old pipes.
Elevated lead levels in the residents of Flint was observed due to the water switch. Flint lacked oversight from the EPA and is an example of lack of enforcement in the Safe Drinking Water Act.
Allegations of tampering, negligence, purposefully altering test results to make it look like Flint's water supply was safe when it was not.
They failed Michigan families. Indeed, they failed us all. I don't care where you live.
Two officials with the State Department of Environmental Quality, Stephen Bush and Mike Prisby, facing charges of official misconduct, tampering with evidence, and violation of the Safe Drinking Water Act. Prosecutors say they deliberately failed to treat the water properly.
There are 1,308 enforcement actions concluded under the Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act, with Flint simply representing one example. And with air quality inducing health concerns such as asthma among our population has to be addressed.
Currently, 125 million Americans live with unhealthy air quality, which is set to rise without EPA oversight. To protect human health, the EPA needs to continue its monitoring of our air to reduce cases of asthma and chronic bronchitis. Climate change will undoubtedly threaten our health. Unpredictable weather events and rising sea levels will force our society to find ways to adapt.
Of the EPA is ensuring safety of chemicals in the marketplace. This includes the regulation of pesticides like atrazine that can cause major health problems if improperly regulated. Without the EPA having the staff and funds to regulate these chemicals, there are concerns that these pesticides will slip into our foods and the environment.
Local law worked to address contaminated sites across the U.S. that posed health risks. The EPA works faster on priority contamination sites similar to sites like Love Canal.
From 1947 until 1952, the Hooker Chemical Company used the Love Canal section of Niagara Falls as a dumping site for toxic waste.
President Carter declared a state of emergency today in the Love Canal area of New York's Niagara Falls, where toxic chemicals were discovered oozing from the ground.
Reviewing history of our presidents and major past events reveals there is a need to change the way we go about the budget process. In order to create change, we created a multifaceted solution.
3 ways to do this is through a shift in values, an operational budget minimum, and for government departments to determine their own budget. Value shift in the U.S. would place environmental protection at the forefront of the policy-making agenda.
Work to push legislators to create more funding for the EPA in particular. However, for this to happen in the U.S., it is evident that there needs to be public attention placed on environmental issues so that funding for the EPA will be prioritized by the administration.
Often, public attention is gained through a major event that draws the public together around an issue. One of the most important triggering events in history was Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which sparked the environmental movement.
At the moment, the government remains stagnant in terms of social support for the environment. The way this issue could be resolved is through another triggering event similar to Silent Spring, which emphasizes government funding for environmental solutions.
Flint, Michigan is an example of a triggering event that has occurred. However, in both the public's eye and the media, there has been a disconnect between funding for the environment and this crisis. In terms of a solution for the EPA budget, increasing public awareness of environmental issues can work to increase the budget within its current form.
This will not change the process of how funding is allocated to the EPA, but rather will cause more funding to be allocated. Another solution to the issue of the EPA not receiving adequate funding would be to create an operational budget minimum.
This means that the EPA would be guaranteed a set amount of money adjusted for inflation every year. This way, the budget would be protected from extreme cuts as a result of changing politics.
Not affect the ability for the budget to increase to account for new programs or incentives, but rather would give the department assurance that they would have a minimum amount to spend on essential services. In this process, the current budget would not change, but there would be a set amount that the president must allocate to each department every year.
The president will still be responsible for creating the budget, which will then go through the House and Senate, but in this process, the budget will have to stay above the operational minimum.
An alternative solution for a more effective budget would incorporate a whole new budget proposal process entirely.
Instead of a budget that is proposed by the president, the different offices that comprise the EPA would propose budgets based on their projections and previous fiscal budgets. This way, underestimations or overestimations of the budget are minimized to project more precise costs.
While the Office of Water would propose an operational budget that will support water regulatory actions, as well as important legislation such as the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. Accumulation of the proposed budgets for each office is achieved, the detailed budget proposal for the fiscal year would be sent to Congress for approval, rejection, or modification.
Should Congress find the budget proposal appropriate, this amount of the United States yearly operational budget will be proportioned for use by the EPA. The President will still reserve the right to oversee all actions of the EPA through appointment of high-ranking officials to manage each office, but will lack the authority to approve the budget themselves.
Limited funding to the EPA has affected our environment and our population's health. As our population steadily increases, we need the EPA to protect clean air and water. We also need the EPA to remediate toxic waste and chemicals for the protection of our health.
Congress has repeatedly added more responsibilities to the EPA. The decrease in funding dramatically affects the way we keep up and update major environmental protection laws, all while the agency's funding dropped 55% in total.
With the reductions in funding, there will be more smog leading to asthma attacks, more toxic compounds leading to cancer and threats to our environment from a changing climate. Reasons to why these new implementations should be considered to fix current problems. By examining the policy process of the budget for the EPA, it's clear there is a need for greater funding. With all of the current environmental concerns, cuts in the EPA's budget will affect the progress on resolving these issues at hand. Implementing one of the three alternatives will move to improve the EPA's agency's work of promoting healthy environment and population health. By protecting our environment, we can work at the EPA's mission to promote health for all constituents in the U.S.